Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to move along here and explore some new material that has to do with what is broadly called critical reasoning. So this presentation refers to um, chapter 4 of the Stanley Baronet textbook, and in particular, it is going to address the idea of informal fallacies. Really, the object of the lesson is to learn areas where our ordinary argumentation skills break down, or some commonly made mistakes in everyday critical reasoning. Okay, so we're just looking at the very first section of the chapter here, section A. Why should we study fallacies? Well, if you can identify a fallacy or the underlying structure of a fallacy, it means you can pick them up more easily in everyday life. And everyday life is filled with bad kinds of argument, right? So a fallacy is really a mistake of logical reasoning. And unless you really study what counts as a valid or sound argument, it may not always be obvious why a particular argument is fallacious or mistaken, right? So we need to, address some criteria or some rules that might assist us in picking up fallacious arguments. So fallacies are instances or cases of flawed reasoning where we have premises that don't actually provide very good reasons for believing the conclusion, right? So if you recall now from chapter 1, we addressed the basic ingredients of what makes for an argument. Arguments build off of premises which contain information in support of a conclusion, right? And we had a look at the formal structure of arguments and came to learn that arguments which are valid include a kind of inference, right? There's a kind of chain of reasoning in which the premises have a logical connection to the conclusions. And in the case of deductive arguments, we learned that valid deductive arguments occur where it is impossible for the conclusion to be false, given true premises, right? So that's sort of our technical definition of validity. When it comes to inductive arguments, and we're going to be exploring induction a little bit more carefully here, inductive arguments don't necessarily require that the conclusion be true in the sense of necessity, but rather strong inductive arguments are ones where it is very likely that that conclusion is true. Okay, so um, where we have a fallacious inductive argument, it might be that actually that conclusion is not very probable, even though maybe it sounds like it would be given the premises. Okay, so a fallacious argument is one where the premise is not actually supporting or connected up in a way that allows for that kind of inferential leap of reasoning that would allow us to believe the conclusion. All right. So let's define fallacies a little bit further. There are two broad types of fallacy: informal and formal. Remember from the first chapter that formal logic really is looking at the underlying structure of an argument, and informal is often pertaining to the content or the subject matter of arguments. So fallacies can pertain to both. They can pertain to subject matter or to structure. Informal fallacies don't necessarily violate the rules of validity, but they do fail to make very compelling conclusions on the basis of premises. So informal fallacies are not necessarily violations of validity, but they don't necessarily persuade us of the truth of the conclusion either. All right, so some of these informal fallacies will require a little bit of reflection and judgment on the part of us. It's not always completely cut and dry in the way that deductive arguments are cut and dry. Fallacious arguments are not logically compelling, but they often are psychologically or emotionally compelling. So we're going to have to think about what this difference really is, right? What's the difference between a logical argument and an emotional or a psychological argument? And we're going to find, I think, pretty quickly that many areas of ordinary life offer up what sound like really compelling arguments when really, if we look at the underlying logical form, it isn't at all a compelling argument, right? So we are very often in the habit of confusing logical rationality with psychological or emotional forms of manipulation, really, or deception. Okay, particularly in areas like politics or in the media, very often arguments might sound very psychologically compelling, or they might actually have a kind of psychological mechanism that manipulates us into believing in the truth of the conclusion when really they haven't offered a particularly compelling logical argument at all. All right. So, what is a good reason for a claim? What counts as evidence? What are the different types of evidence out there when it comes to arguments? As it happens, evidence comes in many different genres, as it were, or there are different types of evidence that might look very different depending on the context, right? When we're talking about a legal context like a courtroom where evidence is provided, we have broad categories of evidence that are offered up in support of a particular case, right? We have what is called circumstantial evidence, where perhaps connections between people involved in the trial might be pointed to. We have physical evidence, which is usually counted as pretty hard evidence in support of a claim, something like DNA evidence. And then we have these categories: preponderance of evidence and reasonable doubt. If you ever end up sitting on a jury in a trial, if the trial is criminal, you will be instructed that the criteria that is relevant for the trial is proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt, right? And so this is different than proof of innocence. Proof of guilt beyond reasonable doubt means that you don't have enough evidence to doubt the person's guilt, but you don't have positive proof of their guilt necessarily. Preponderance of evidence pertains to civil trials, where the prosecutor doesn't necessarily have to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but really has to just stack up enough evidence such that there is a preponderance or a kind of undeniable accumulation of evidence in support of a particular argument. Okay, so the law comes furnished with all kinds of pretty sophisticated definitions for what would count as evidence, and it has to go through a very rigorous process of vetting evidence that ever even makes it into trial or is excluded from trial. In science, we have very rigorous quality control in terms of what counts as evidence in support of a claim. We have what is called empirical evidence, which is a very broad category. We can't really address what empirical evidence in the sciences means here in this context, but suffice it to say that science has developed a very sophisticated kind of barrage of instruments designed for picking up evidence in the natural world. And then it has, of course, the scientific method. And the scientific method is meant to be a kind of process in which the empirical evidence collected is vetted in such a manner that conclusions really do follow from the evidence gathered. Okay, if you end up taking a philosophy of science class, you will find that what it means to have a scientific method that really proves arguments is actually an incredibly complicated process. But science is known as a discipline, whether it's natural, biological, or chemical, that produces very good reasons for the claims it makes, right? Now, very common types of evidence in everyday life are much kind of flimsier and less substantial than those offered in law or in science. We have anecdotal evidence where, let's say, a friend just provides a kind of a brief reporting of their day in support of a claim, right? Lots of our conversations are really just anecdotal. Anecdotal means evidence that refers just to one person alone, and so therefore that evidence is not easily verified, cannot easily be confirmed, right? Because it just happened to one person. We have testimonial evidence that might pertain to the context of law as well, but testimony, whether expert or non-expert, can provide support for a claim. We have analogical evidence. We'll talk a little bit further about this, but this is where comparisons between things are really made in support of an argument. Analogies, right, are something you end up having to study for the SAT, right? And really, it's just a kind of logical process that explores the deeper patterns of relationships between objects. Statistical evidence is often provided in the media in support of a particular claim or worldview. It's often provided in advertising and PR, right? If I can show you large numbers that point to a trend in things happening, I can perhaps bend you to believe in a certain position, right? But all kinds of mistakes can be made with statistics, right? And we'll have to explore some of the ways in which statistics can be a very misleading form of evidence. Now, there are kind of some broad fallacies of argumentation that probably we have all had experience with, and that I hope by the end of this class you'll be very good at identifying in the real world. Fallacies that are based on personal attacks or emotional appeals are psychological forms of manipulation, and they often occur in politics, but they can occur in your everyday life. Okay, so we're going to explore a couple of different categories of emotional appeal and personal attack. But when evaluating arguments in everyday life, we should always remember to judge the truth of a statement and the strength of the argument objectively, right? And so that means we need to adopt a kind of disinterested perspective that is solely interested in whether or not premises are really rationally connecting up with conclusions. Now, this can be very, very difficult to do because we all have prejudices that might inflect, that might shape how we approach evidence, right? All of us are going to be more inclined to believing certain things rather than others. And all of the factors that might lead into those prejudices include our upbringing, the values our parents instilled in us, our training, our education, our experience of other people. So it is very, very hard for us to be truly objective. But note that logical and valid arguments are they are striving for this standard of objectivity. So if we can study fallacious reasoning, we can become better attuned to objective judgment, towards disinterested judgment rather than prejudicial judgment. Okay, we should reject the truth claims of arguments when objective evidence contradicts claims. We're going to talk a lot in this class about the logic of contradiction and what it means for claims to be contradictory or logically opposed. But we should note that contradiction is a very useful tool in invalidating certain arguments, right? If we can chance upon a claim that is contradictory with other claims, we should, objectively speaking, reject the argument in question. All right, so we'll have a closer look at the logic of contradiction, as it will prove to be a very useful tool for us. Whoops, missed a point here. Arguments that try to prove their claim by attacking the person involved or manipulating emotions should be rejected as fallacious cases of reasoning. Okay, so the standard of logic, the ideal of logical validity, is a very unemotional ideal, right? Objectivity is meant to be very much independent of your emotional investment in the truth or falsity of a given claim, right? So arguments tend to become easily spotted as fallacious when they are dredging up lots of emotions, when they are insulting the person involved rather than articulating a contradictory position to the claim, And so, if we can get sort of uh, versed in the ways in which arguments descend into emotion and um, and insult or perhaps attack, personal attack, rather than looking at the formal structure of arguments, we can sort of defend ourselves from these forms of manipulation better. Okay, I know I'm speaking sort of abstractly here, and all these kind of ideals are really just that so far. They are ideals for what would make a good argument. Let's look at a little bit more in more detail at the kind of thing that would count as a fallacy. The most common kind of informal fallacy we find in everyday life is called ad hominem. This is a Latin expression that simply means a personal attack. An ad hominem argument is one where some personal characteristic of an individual is attacked as a response to an argument, such as their lack of experience, their association with some perceived negative group, or as having vested interest in a claim. Okay, so the ad hominem occurs really a lot in politics. You will find ad hominem in debates between candidates for presidency or governor, right, where some political topic will come up, let's say foreign policy, and instead of offering a counter foreign policy, the candidate will simply throw a lot of mud at his opponent or her opponent in an attempt to discredit that person, right? So ad hominem is a way of kind of redirecting one's attention away from the argument, really, in order to kind of discredit the person making the argument. And the reason why the argument breaks down is because it doesn't actually prove much of anything. It's just kind of a distraction mechanism. But unfortunately, it's one that might be very emotionally compelling. How does it work? Not liking or not believing or disbelieving a person does not actually undermine their argument. In other words, even if I really viscerally hate the presidential candidate in question and their opponent points out some of their unlikable qualities, that fact in no way actually discredits the content of their argument nor the formal structure of their argument. I might think I have undermined their argument because, after all, how could such an unlikable candidate in any way be possessing truth? But unfortunately, it is not actually a logical contradiction for an unlikable person to be saying something that is true, right? In order to actually undermine the argument, we need to attack the argument head on rather than redirecting one's attention towards the character of the person making the argument. Why does the reasoning fail? What someone claims and their argument in support of it is distinct from whether or not we like them or think they will gain in some way if the argument succeeds. So what am I saying here? The content of the argument is different from the person. The content and the logical process of the argument is different from whether or not we really like the person or not. And so if we're to be objective, if we're to be logical in our evaluation of people's arguments, we should be able to separate content and form from person and character. Now, that's kind of a broad category, the ad hominem, but there are sort of smaller subspecies of that broader genre of ad hominem. We have kind of an instance that looks something like this. X is a bad argument because Y, who advanced it, and Y doesn't know what he's talking about, right? So we might try to raise the possibility that the speaker or the claimant is not credentialed or doesn't have knowledge of the topic. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, isn't it very relevant for a presidential candidate to kind of have experience and knowledge of the subject that they're dealing with? And well, yes, it is very relevant, but simply pointing to a personal lack of credentialing isn't sufficient reason to believe that the content of the argument is false. All right, that's a kind of slippage in reasoning that is very easy for us to make. Okay, so logic really, or critical reasoning, insists that we hold those things apart. Here's another kind of variety. um, of ad hominem, you might encounter something of this type. X is a bad argument because the person advancing it is only doing it because of their affiliation with a group that has an interest in seeing the claim succeed. This is kind of vague here, I guess, but really what the idea is that you are pointing to a politician or some other figure and saying that they're only speaking what they're speaking because they have an interest in, um, or they belong to a group that has an interested claim in the outcome, right? And all of that might actually be true, but the content of what they're saying might still also be true, right? It isn't actually a contradiction to point to, let's say, membership in a lobby, for example, as proof that the political policy they're putting forth is false, right? You have to actually go about the business of pointing to the reason why the claim is still false, independently of whatever association or belonging that that member might have in the group. All right, so here's another example. X is a bad argument because Y, who advanced it, doesn't follow his own advice. This is a very common one in politics. This is kind of saying that the person is a hypocrite or the person doesn't do what he preaches, and so therefore the argument itself must be untrue. That actually doesn't logically follow. Counterintuitive as it might sound, a person might very well in politics fail to live up to the policy that they're advocating, but that policy in and of itself is not therefore invalidated. It might still be a perfectly sound and pragmatic policy, right? So we have to separate out the content of the argument from the circumstance surrounding which the person is advocating it. Okay, and that can be very difficult to do because politicians are meant to be not only architects of policy, but like examples um, of virtuous people that we're meant to sort of imitate in life, right? And so ad hominems are very susceptible to distortion in our beliefs. We have another variety of the ad hominem. It is called the ad hominem circumstantial. And what this refers to is a fallacy of reasoning where someone's argument is rejected based on the circumstances surrounding their life. And by that we mean things like upbringing, people they might know, whether they are wealthy or poor, what region of the country they are born in. And usually the ad hominem circumstantial is kind of a prejudicial attack on those circumstances, right? We're trying to raise suspicion about the lack of credibility of the person based on very arbitrary circumstances. Circumstances might include their affiliation to an institution like a party or a church. Could be their educational institution, their place of birth, some protected categories like religion or race. All of these are usually pretty straightforwardly prejudicial efforts to discredit the person rather than invalidate their argument, right? Back when Barack Obama was running for president, uh, there were, this is probably, I guess, too old for most of you now, amazingly, but there were all these kind of arguments about the circumstances of his birth as to whether or not he was actually born in America. And even after he proved he was born in Hawaii, which is, of course, an American state, the suggestion was repeatedly raised that he was perhaps Muslim, perhaps African, perhaps an elite member of a kind of hyper-educated class, right? There were all these efforts to sort of undermine the circumstances surrounding who he was rather than an effort to discredit the arguments he was making about politics. Okay, so the ad hominem circumstantial is a very, very frequent fallacy of reasoning in political life, in election cycles in particular. Poisoning the well. Poisoning the well is a type of informal fallacy where, and it's an ad hominem where you attack the person before they even make their argument, right? So it's really just a kind of quick uh, version of the mudslinging stuff we've talked about, right? If I can kind of um, raise the suspicion in someone's mind that this person is not credible before they've even made an argument, the chances are I won't really hear what they have to say, right? So it's a very effective rhetorical strategy in politics, but unfortunately it does entail fallacious reasoning. The fallacy often uses circumstantial evidence to paint a negative picture of a person to undermine their argument. So we're poisoning the well in the sense that we are um, sort of ruining the chances that they will even be taken seriously before they enter the argument, right? The argument has kind of been soured or poisoned even before it's unfolded, even before the reasons are given in support of a conclusion. And it can be a really effective psychological tactic uh, because people are going to be much, much less receptive to believing an argument if the well surrounding the circumstances of their life, as it were, has already been poisoned, right? Try as we might, we're probably going to be operating with kind of a prejudiced point of view. The goggles through which we look at this person will be very colored in a certain way. Okay, so those are some varieties of ad hominem. We have also one that's very frequent called tu quoque. This is kind of Latinate expression. And the fallacy is characterized as an attempt to avoid the issue at hand by claiming that the person making the argument is a hypocrite. Um, this sort of sounds more complicated than it is. It really is just kind of a look who's talking type of argument, right? It's really a way of just kind of deflecting the issue by putting it back on the person, usually who is making a negative claim about the other. Okay, so politicians again use this all the time. It's a really great and effective psychological trick at sort of steering an audience's attention away from the issue at hand by pointing to um, sort of some perceived negative trait in the advocate for the argument, right? The fallacy occurs because it doesn't specifically contradict the person's evidence or chain of reasoning. Really, instead of contradicting the evidence, it is simply putting the negative outcome of the argument back on the speaker of the argument in order to raise suspicion about the credibility of their reasoning process. Okay, so I think politicians use and are really trained to use tu quoque all the time. It's a very effective way, particularly when dealing with the media, of deflecting criticism. Okay. Okay, moving along here. To get into the nitty gritty of emotional appeals a little bit, this is an area of critical reasoning that I think we can observe in the media a lot and in advertising. It's really quite common to draw on our emotional states of mind in order to persuade us into certain positions. So psychology actually studies at great length, much more than philosophy probably, how to appeal to one's emotional life. Some arguments are really designed to manipulate our psychology. Some arguments are not at all intended as efforts towards advancing a true claim. So we should be aware and like become good at guarding ourselves against these manipulations, right? And very often the manipulations occur in commercials, in op-eds, in newspapers, or in political arguments. And the kind of pattern that is very easily seen is that arguments are not made so much as attempts are made to provoke really almost infantile or childish emotions in us in order that we don't do any critical reasoning, right? That's really what the tactic or the technique of manipulation is about. It's an attempt to stop short our critical reasoning faculties. So attempts are made to provoke emotions, usually in very large numbers of people. So there's a kind of psychology of groupthink that is also quite relevant to this procedure. Valid arguments can have an emotional character, right? So validity is not completely opposed to emotion, but validity is something different, right? The truth of an argument, the validity of a deductive argument is something that we test and evaluate, not through how it makes us feel, but whether or not the conclusion is offered up in support of premises in a rational way. Okay, so this is kind of a confusing point, but I'm just trying to draw out that, you know, we shouldn't think of validity and emotion as completely opposed, but really validity has a kind of independence from emotion that means that some arguments, are going to provoke feelings in us that maybe are not so good, but that argument might still be true if we really assess the structure of the premises and the conclusion. So there are different versions of appealing to emotion that we should be aware of out there, and I'm just going to address a few of them. There are far more than this actually listed in the book by Baronet, but I'm just picking up sort of the high frequency fallacies out there. We have the fallacy known as an appeal to the people, or an argumentum ad populum, and what this means is an appeal to the masses, right? It's really kind of a kind of group think kind of fallacy. How it works, it's kind of an appeal to the fact that lots of people do feel this way, right? And so therefore, whatever the position that's being advocated must be true, right? It's kind of manipulating us into a kind of fear of missing out, right? It's sort of drawing on our fear of not belonging to a group, and therefore, trying to nudge us into buying into a certain position that a group might feel. Why does this reasoning fail? Well, believing a claim simply because everybody else, quote unquote, believes it does not in any way demonstrate the truth of the claim, right? The claim has not been demonstrated. All that has been demonstrated is that large numbers of people believe the claim, right? And as we can probably understand now, there are all kinds of things in the world that large numbers of people believe that have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not that claim is true. People are capable, in large numbers, of believing utterly ridiculous and false things, right? So be wary of any appeal to the masses, any appeal to the people as a rationale, as a reason given in exchange for an actual inferential claim. There are different kinds of appealing to the people out there, different flavors, as it were, or varieties of appealing to the people that we should be aware of. We have what's called group solidarity. Group solidarity refers to, the idea that we should believe in a claim because it's sort of is connected up with a sympathetic group. It's connected up with a community that might be of value to us, right? The claim might sort of be a claim referring to one's belonging to a nation or to their identity. Usually it's a kind of tribalistic type of argument, right? And it sort of is related, and this one you might be more familiar with to what's known as the bandwagon effect. And this is much studied by psychologists. The bandwagon effect is a sort of an effort to appeal to the popularity of a certain position or perhaps lifestyle, right? So again, it's drawing on this anxiety we might have of not fitting into the group or being excluded or marginalized from the group. And so we're sort of nudged into believing a certain position that a group might believe, right? So be wary of all bandwagon effect appeals. Elite group. The elite group fallacy is any effort to appeal to exclusivity or any appeal to a position that might be adopted by a very wealthy or kind of high social status group, whether it's, let's say, I don't know, you've graduated from an Ivy League school, right? And there's this kind of effort to say that Ivy League school graduates believe in certain political views, and so you should too, right? So the elite group fallacy there would be the idea that the truth of a certain position is an attribute simply of membership in this perceived elite group, right? Notice that in that case, the argument actually hasn't been made for believing in the truth of the conclusion. You're simply appealing to the longing, the desire we might have to belong to the group too. And we see this in advertising in kind of a subconscious way all the time, right? Where we're sort of invited to belong into the lives of very elite people simply by purchasing the commodity that's being sold to us, right? Without actually giving any explanation why that commodity might be any good, right? So the elite group fallacy is all over the world of advertising, and it's a very effective psychological rhetorical tactic. Here's some examples of appealing to the people. If I say something like 70% of Americans think marriage equality is immoral, therefore you should not support same-sex marriage, right? The fallacy here is kind of the majoritarian fallacy. Just because the majority of Americans think marriage equality is immoral, you should too. Why is this a fallacy? Well, I haven't actually proven anything about, what would be better or more moral about the position. I'm simply saying you should adopt the standard or the position of the majority, as though it were self-evident that the majority was right, right? But the majority might very well be wrong, right? So another version, kind of the same, cut from the same cloth here, would be to say an overwhelming majority of Americans, 92%, believe in God and an afterlife. Therefore, you should stop being an atheist. Okay, so if we get involved in this kind of theological argument, the claim might be that this huge majority of people believe in God, and so therefore, I guess the suggestion would be that it's irrational or maybe a little crazy even not to believe in God, and so you should adopt this faith-based point of view. Again, no reasons are actually supplied for believing in God. They're just simply pointing to what the majority of people happen to believe, as though that were reason enough to believe in the conclusion. Okay, so this would be an example of kind of a bandwagon effect version of the appeal to the people. Here's another example. Most people are coming around to the idea that medical and recreational marijuana use is acceptable. Therefore, you should endorse legalization of marijuana. So, politically speaking, these appeals to the people can go any which way. It's not about right, left, right. Both sides use it. In this case, we have the claim that legalization of marijuana is good or pragmatic, and really the only evidence given is that lots of people think so, right? So rather than pointing to some of the positive benefits of legalization, maybe it could be getting people out of jail or improving their health through recreational use. Any evidence that might be supplied is given up in favor of simply pointing to this huge number of people, presumably, that believes the position, right? So this would count as a fallacy of an emotional appeal or an appeal to the people. Appeal to pity, this is called an argumentum ad misericordiam. It's very common in advertising. What is it? A conclusion is supported by evoking pity from the listener or reader, and this pity does not have much to do with the situation for which he wants pity. So the idea here is that rather than building an argument in which a conclusion is defended on the basis of a relationship to evidence, really the arguer is just pulling on the person's heartstrings, right? It's kind of an appeal to how awful a certain situation would be and how terrible you should feel if you failed to do something, right? And so really, it's not a rational argument at all. It's just a direct manipulation of one's emotions, right? Why does this fail? Feeling sorry does not make what the person claims true. That person might be uttering an utter falsehood, despite the sympathetic circumstances surrounding the argument, right? So this is very common in political life and media life. Okay, so be wary of all appeals to pity. We then have appeal to force or fear, argumentum ad baculum. These are pretty obvious to spot. This is simply just, rather than building an argument, you threaten the person with force, right? Usually this is kind of going to be offered up in exchange for rationality in political climates that are very authoritarian or very totalitarian. Claim that relies on threat of violence or the threat of punishment in exchange for reason is an appeal to force. Okay. Um, why does the reasoning fail? Well, there is no reasoning, right? The conclusion is accepted not because it's true, but because one simply fears the consequences of not accepting, or at least behaving as though one accepted the conclusion. So the appeal to force is almost the opposite of rationality. It's just simply exchanging threats and violence for a chain of reasons or evidence for believing something. Okay, so that's a pretty good start here. This is a list really just of some thou shalt nots, right? These are some rules um, to live by if one wants to be making valid arguments in everyday life. These are some fallacies to start to be on the lookout for. So we're going to move ahead in future videos with a few more examples of this. And then we will kind of return in the next chapter to more formal logic and get into the grammar of syllogisms.